Sometimes the only person standing between a child and a cruel world is someone the world has already condemned. When 6-year-old Mabel watches the man who saved her life get dragged to the gallows, she knows her heart is about to break forever. In the dusty town of Dry Creek, Jasper Dalton is set to hang at dawn. The townspeople call him Iron Fist and whisper about his violent past. But little Mabel sees something different, the gentle giant who became her protector after her parents were murdered. Sheriff Knox Brennan believes he's bringing justice to their town. The rope is ready, the crowd is gathering, and time is running out. But what if everything they think they know about Jasper Dalton is wrong? What if the real monster is hiding behind a badge? Will the truth come out before it's too late to save the only father Mabel has ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, when Jasper Dalton first rode into Dry Creek, the desert wind carried more than dust. It carried the scent of change. His horse's hooves kicked up small clouds as he guided the weary mare down the main street, past the weathered storefronts and sun-bleached wooden sidewalks. The townspeople paused in their daily routines to watch this stranger, noting his impressive height and the way his broad shoulders filled his faded coat. But what they noticed most was what wasn't there. No gun belt hung from his hips, no iron rested against his thigh. The old gun belt now hung on a nail in the small room he rented above Murphy's General Store, a silent testament to the man he used to be. Jasper would look at it sometimes in the morning light filtering through his single window, remembering the weight of it, the cold comfort of steel that once defined his very existence. But those days were behind him now, buried with the last of his family in a grave he dug with his own hands 2 years prior. Dry Creek was a town that minded its own business, which suited Jasper fine. The folks here had enough troubles without borrowing more from a stranger's past. The drought had been hard on everyone, and the recent cattle rustling had left the ranchers nervous and quick to anger. Sheriff Knox Brennan kept order with an iron fist and a suspicious eye, traits that had served him well in his 5 years wearing the badge. Knox was a man who believed in simple justice, the kind delivered swift and sure, without much room for doubt or second chances. He'd built his reputation on being tough but fair, though those who looked closely might notice how his definition of fairness seemed to shift depending on who stood before him. The wealthy ranchers found him remarkably understanding, while drifters and strangers often discovered his patience ran considerably thinner. It was on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Jasper's arrival, that everything changed. The screaming started just after dawn, high and desperate, cutting through the quiet air like a blade. Jasper was already awake, preparing for another day of odd jobs that kept food on his table and a roof over his head. He'd found work wherever he could, repairing fences, shoeing horses, fixing broken wagon wheels. His hands, though large enough to span a man's throat, moved with surprising gentleness when mending delicate things. The screaming came from the old Henderson place, a ramshackle cabin on the edge of town where Tom and Martha Henderson had raised their family. Tom was a good man, a hard worker who scratched out a living hauling freight between towns. Martha took in washing and mending, her skilled fingers bringing new life to worn-out clothes. They had one child, a bright-eyed little girl named Mabel, who could already read better than some adults and had a smile that could warm even the coldest morning. Jasper reached the cabin the same time as Doc Henley, the town's physician, and one of the few people who'd shown him any kindness since his arrival. What they found inside would haunt both men for the rest of their days. Tom and Martha Henderson lay in pools of their own blood, their lives ended with brutal efficiency. The cabin had been ransacked, drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, but this hadn't been a simple robbery. This had been something far more impersonal, far more vicious. "Dear God," Doc Henley whispered, removing his hat as he knelt beside Martha's still form. The woman's face was peaceful, despite the violence that had taken her. as if her final moments had carried her somewhere beyond pain. But it was the continued crying that drew Jasper deeper into the cabin. Following the sound, he found a closet where Mabel had hidden herself, pressed into the far corner behind her mother's winter dresses. Her blue dress was torn, her face streaked with tears and dust, and her whole small body shook with terror. When she saw Jasper's large frame filling the closet doorway, she pressed herself even further into the corner. "Easy there, little one," Jasper said, his voice gentle as morning rain. He crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. "My name's Jasper. I'm here to help." Mabel stared at him with eyes that had seen too much, her small fists clutching a worn rag doll that had obviously provided comfort through the terrifying night. "They killed Mama and Papa," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The bad men with the bandanas." "I know, sweetheart. I know." Jasper extended one large hand, palm up, letting her see that he meant no harm. "But you're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." Something in his voice, some quality of absolute certainty, reached through Mabel's terror. She looked into his weathered face and saw not the hard lines of violence that others noticed, but the gentle creases around his eyes that spoke of sorrow and understanding. Slowly, carefully, she placed her small hand in his. By the time Sheriff Knox arrived with his deputy, Wade Cartwright, Jasper had coaxed Mabel from her hiding place and was sitting with her on the front porch, speaking quietly, while Doc Henley examined the scene inside. Knox's jaw tightened when he saw the stranger comforting the child, his lawman's instincts immediately suspicious. "What's your business here, Dalton?" Knox's voice carried the authority of his badge and the barely concealed hostility he felt toward any man whose past remained deliberately vague. "Heard the screaming," Jasper replied, his arm protective around Mabel's small shoulders. "Got here same time as Doc Henley." Knox studied the scene with practiced eyes, noting the violence, the ransacked room, the personal nature of the attack. This wasn't random. Someone had come here with a purpose, and that someone had wanted the Hendersons to suffer. His gaze moved to Jasper, taking in the man's size, his obvious strength, the careful way he held himself. "You know anything about—" "What happened here?" Knox asked, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "No more than you do," Jasper answered, meeting the sheriff's suspicious stare without flinching. "But whoever did this, they're long gone now." Knox questioned Mabel gently, but the child could tell them little beyond what she'd already shared. 3 men with covered faces had broken down the door just before dawn. They'd demanded something from her father, something about money or papers, and when Tom Henderson swore he didn't know what they were talking about, the violence had escalated quickly. In the days that followed, as the town mourned the Hendersons and searched for their killers, Jasper found himself unexpectedly responsible for Mabel. There was no other family, no relatives to take her in. The town had an orphanage of sorts. Widow Morrison's boarding house, where unwanted children were fed and sheltered, but little more. It was a cold place, run by a woman who'd had the kindness worn out of her by too many years of other people's troubles. But Mabel wouldn't go. She clung to Jasper with the desperate strength of a child who'd already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. When Knox suggested the orphanage, Mabel shook her head violently and pressed closer to the big man who'd become her anchor in a suddenly dangerous world. "I'll look after her," Jasper said quietly, surprising everyone, including himself. "Until something permanent can be arranged." Knox frowned. "You don't know anything about raising a child, Dalton. Hell, we don't know anything about you except you rode in here a week ago with no past and no references." "The child's been through enough," Doc Henley interjected, his voice carrying the weight of his years and his standing in the community. "Let the man help her. Lord knows she needs someone right now." And so began an unlikely partnership that would change both their lives. Jasper moved from his small room above the general store to the Henderson cabin, cleaning up the blood and repairing the damage, making it safe and comfortable for a little girl who'd seen too much darkness. He bought fabric and hired Mrs. Patterson to make new curtains, replacing the ones stained with tragedy. He fixed the broken furniture and painted over the scars left by violence. Mabel watched it all with solemn eyes, saying little but noticing everything. She saw how Jasper's hands, large enough to crush a man's windpipe, moved with infinite care when braiding her hair each morning. She noticed how he always made sure she had the last biscuit at dinner, how he read to her each night, from the Bible or from the few precious books her parents had owned. "Why are you being nice to me?" she asked one evening as Jasper tucked her into the bed he'd built with his own hands, replacing the one destroyed in the attack. Jasper considered the question seriously, understanding that children deserved honest answers, especially children who'd grown up too fast. "Because everyone deserves someone to look after them," he said finally. "And because your mama and papa would want someone to make sure you're safe. Were you someone's papa before?" The question came softly, without accusation, but Jasper felt it hit him like a physical blow. "Once," he admitted, his voice rough, "with old grief. A long time ago." Mabel nodded as if this explained everything, and perhaps for her, it did. She'd learned that grown-ups carried sadness the way she carried her doll, close and protective, something that helped them get through the dark times. As the weeks passed, the townspeople watched this odd pairing with growing acceptance, though suspicion never entirely faded. They saw Jasper walking Mabel to the schoolhouse each morning, his long stride shortened to match her small steps. They watched him wait patiently while she practiced her letters, never showing frustration when she struggled with difficult words. On Sundays, they attended church together, Jasper's presence in the back pew, a reminder that even hard men could find room for God. But it was Sheriff Knox who remained most troubled by the arrangement. Something about Jasper Dalton nagged at him, some half-remembered whisper or wanted poster that refused to come clear in his memory. The man was too calm, too controlled, too comfortable with violence even when he wasn't using it. Knox had seen enough dangerous men to recognize the signs, and every instinct told him that Jasper Dalton was a man with blood on his hands. The truth was that Knox's suspicions weren't entirely wrong. Jasper had indeed been a violent man, one of the most feared outlaws in 3 territories. But that was before he'd lost everything that mattered, before he'd learned that violence only bred more violence, before he decided that the only way to honor his dead family was to become the kind of man they'd have been proud to know. The gun belt hanging on the nail in his room had belonged to Iron Fist Dalton, a name spoken in whispers around campfires and in saloons. But that man was as dead as his wife and son, buried in the same grave that had given birth to the gentle giant who now braided a little girl's hair and read her bedtime stories. As autumn settled over Dry Creek, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Jasper and Mabel had found something like peace. The nightmares came less frequently now, and Mabel's laughter, when it came, sounded genuine rather than forced. They'd built routines that felt almost like family. Breakfast together at the small table Jasper had crafted, evening walks through town where Mabel would point out interesting rocks or unusual clouds, and quiet hours when Jasper would whittle small toys while Mabel practiced her reading. It was a life neither of them had expected, built from tragedy and held together by the simple recognition that sometimes broken people could heal each other. But peace, as Jasper had learned long ago, was often more fragile than the desert flowers that bloomed briefly after rain, beautiful for a moment before the harsh world reclaimed them. The storm that would test everything they'd built was already gathering on the horizon, carried by men with darker hearts and hidden agendas. But for now, in these golden autumn days, a former outlaw and an orphaned child had found something precious in their shared solitude, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, not by law, but by love. The scream that shattered the November dawn carried a different quality than the one that had brought Jasper to the Henderson cabin 3 months earlier. This one held not just terror, but the sharp edge of recognition, someone discovering a Horror they never expected to find. It came from the direction of the Sterling Ranch, the largest spread in the county, owned by cattle baron Harrison Sterling and his precious daughter Victoria. Jasper was already dressed and preparing breakfast. When the sound reached him, Mabel stirred in her bed, the cry pulling her from sleep with the cruel efficiency that only children who'd known violence could understand. Her small hand immediately reached for the rag doll that never left her side, clutching it protectively as her eyes found Jasper's reassuring presence. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice still thick with sleep but alert with concern. "I don't know, little one," Jasper admitted, moving to the window to peer toward the Sterling property. In the distance, he could see riders gathering, dark, shapes against the pale morning sky. "But it's nothing for you to worry about. You stay here and keep the door locked until I come back." "No!" The word burst from Mabel with surprising force. "Don't leave me alone, please!" Jasper knelt beside her bed, understanding flooding his weathered features. Of course she would be terrified. The last time she'd been left alone, she'd hidden in a closet while her parents were murdered in the next room. He gathered her into his arms, feeling her small body tremble against his chest. "You're right," he said gently. "We'll go together, but we stay back just to see what's happening. Deal?" Mabel nodded against his shoulder, and within minutes they were walking hand in hand toward the commotion. Other townspeople had heard the scream too, and a small crowd was gathering at the edge of Sterling's property. Doc Henley arrived on his horse just as Jasper and Mabel reached the group, his medical bag bouncing against his leg as he dismounted. What they found in the small grove of cottonwoods behind the Sterling house was a scene that would haunt Dry Creek for years to come. Victoria Sterling, the beautiful 22-year-old daughter of the town's most powerful man, lay beneath the trees in a position that spoke of violence and struggle. Her blue dress was torn, the fabric scattered in pieces among the fallen leaves, like grotesque flower petals. One particular piece caught on a low branch, fluttered in the morning breeze, a torn fragment that would later prove more significant than anyone realized. Harrison Sterling stood over his daughter's body, his face a mask of grief and rage. The old rancher had built his fortune through determination and ruthlessness, but no amount of money or power could bring back what mattered most to him. His hands shook as he knelt beside Victoria, and when he looked up at the gathering crowd, his eyes held the dangerous light of a man with nothing left to lose. "Someone did this to my girl," he said, his voice carrying across the morning air with deadly certainty. "Someone in this town murdered my Victoria. And by God, I'll see them. Hang for it." Sheriff Knox arrived with his deputy Wade Cartwright just as Doc Henley was completing his preliminary examination. Knox's sharp eyes took in the scene quickly: the torn dress, the signs of struggle, the position of the body. This was no accident, no crime of opportunity. This was deliberate, personal, violent. "Anyone see anything?" Knox called out to the assembled crowd. "Anyone hear anything besides the scream this morning?" An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. People shifted nervously, glancing at each other with the wariness that comes when violent death strikes close to home. Finally, old Pete Morrison, Widow Morrison's brother-in-law, cleared his throat nervously. "I was checking my traps early this morning," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Saw someone running through the trees heading away from here. Big fellow, moving." Fast, Knox's attention sharpened immediately. "How big? Can you describe him?" Pete's eyes darted nervously toward Jasper before looking away. "Real tall, broad shoulders, moved like a man who knew how to handle himself in a fight." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. In a town the size of Dry Creek, there weren't many men who fit that description. Knox's gaze moved deliberately through the crowd until it settled on Jasper, standing quietly with Mabel's small hand clutched in his own. "That's a serious accusation, Pete," Knox said slowly. "You sure about what you saw?" "I know what I saw," Pete replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Can't say for certain it was anyone in particular, but it was definitely a big man running from this direction." Harrison Sterling's grief-stricken eyes followed Knox's gaze to Jasper, and something cold and calculating settled in his expression. Here was someone to blame, someone to focus his rage upon. The fact that Jasper was an outsider, a man with no family connections or political influence, made him perfect for Sterling's purposes. "I want him arrested," Sterling demanded, pointing directly at Jasper. "That man's been nothing but trouble since he arrived, living with that child like he's some kind of saint, but I know what he really is." "Now hold on," Doc Henley interjected, his voice carrying the authority of his years and education. "You can't just accuse a man without evidence." "Evidence?" Sterling's voice rose dangerously. "My daughter is dead, and that man was seen running from the scene. What more evidence do you need?" Knox studied Jasper carefully, noting the man's calm demeanor, the way he protectively positioned himself between the crowd and Mabel. There was something about Dalton that had always bothered him, something that whispered of hidden violence beneath the surface gentleness. "Where were you early this morning, Dalton?" Knox asked, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "At home with Mabel," Jasper replied evenly. "We were having breakfast when we heard the scream. Anyone else see you there?" "Just Mabel." Knox's expression hardened. The word of a child isn't worth much in court, especially a child who depends on you for everything. Mabel pressed closer to Jasper's side, sensing the growing hostility in the crowd. She could feel the change in the air, the way people were looking at the man who'd become her whole world. It was the same look she'd seen in people's eyes when they talked about the bad men who'd killed her parents. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling clarity. "Jasper would never hurt anyone." Harrison Sterling looked down at the child with something approaching sympathy, but his grief had hardened into a need for vengeance that wouldn't be satisfied by a little girl's testimony. "Child doesn't know what men are capable of," he said grimly, "especially men with blood on their hands." The crowd murmured agreement, fear and suspicion spreading like wildfire through their ranks. They remembered the stories, whispered tales, of Jasper's mysterious past, the way he'd arrived in town with no explanations and no references. They thought about his size, his obvious strength, the careful way he carried himself that spoke of familiarity with violence. Knox made his decision with the swift certainty of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts, even when those instincts were guided more by politics than justice. "Jasper Dalton, you're under arrest for the murder of Victoria Sterling." The words hit Mabel like a physical blow. She watched in horror as Deputy Cartwright moved forward with iron shackles as the crowd stepped back to give the lawman room. To work, this couldn't be happening, not again. Not when she'd finally found someone who made her feel safe. No, she screamed, throwing herself against Jasper's legs, wrapping her small arms around him as tightly as she could. "You can't take him. He didn't do anything." Jasper knelt down to her level, his large hands gentle on her shoulders despite the shackles now binding his wrists. "Listen to me, Mabel," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "This is all a mistake, and mistakes get fixed. But until they do, you need to be brave for me. Can you do that?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, though her whole body shook with the effort of not screaming again. Doc Henley stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "I'll look after her until this gets sorted out," he promised, though his eyes held doubt about how quickly that might happen. The trial, if it could be called that, took place 3 days later in the town hall. Judge Nathaniel Pierce had ridden in from the county seat, a hard man who believed in swift justice and had little patience for legal niceties when the evidence seemed clear. Harrison Sterling's influence extended far beyond Dry Creek, and his demand for immediate justice carried significant weight. The proceedings were more spectacle than trial. Pete Morrison repeated his testimony about seeing a large man running. From the scene, Sterling himself testified about Jasper's suspicious behavior and mysterious past. Knox presented what little physical evidence there was, Footprints near the body that could have belonged to any large man. The lack of an alibi except for a child's word. Jasper's defense was minimal. He had no lawyer, no character witnesses. Besides Doc Henley and little Mabel, his past remained carefully hidden, which only made him appear more guilty in the eyes of the jury. When asked directly if he had killed Victoria Sterling, he answered with simple dignity, "I did not." But dignity doesn't stop a lynch mob disguised as justice. The verdict came quickly. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence followed. Immediately after, death by hanging at dawn. As the gavel fell, sealing Jasper's fate, Mabel's anguished cry cut through the courthouse like a blade. She threw herself toward the defendant's table, desperate to reach the man who'd become her father in everything but name. Deputies held her back as Jasper was led away in chains, his eyes never leaving her tear-stained face. "I'll find a way." Doc Henley whispered to her as the crowd dispersed, satisfaction and unease warring in their expressions. "I'll find a way to prove his innocence." But as night fell over Dry Creek, and Jasper sat in his cell contemplating his final dawn, it seemed that justice had already spoken. The only question now was whether truth would have time to catch up before the rope ended any chance of redemption. Outside the jail, Mabel pressed her face against the cold bars of the window, her small voice carrying promises and prayers into the darkness where the only man who'd ever truly protected her waited for morning, and the gallows that would steal him away forever. The Dry Creek jail had never been built to hold a man like Jasper Dalton for long. Its iron bars were sturdy enough, but they couldn't contain the growing unease that settled over the town like dust after a storm. In the 2 days since the trial, cracks had begun to show in the certainty that had convicted him so quickly. Mabel visited twice each day, morning and evening, clutching her ragdoll and pressing as close to the bars as Deputy Cartwright would allow. She'd brought Jasper his meals. Biscuits she'd helped Doc Henley's housekeeper make, water from the well behind the medical office, and small wildflowers she'd picked from the vacant lot beside the church. "Tell me the story about the rabbit." "Again," she whispered during her evening visit, her small fingers wrapped around the cold iron bars. Jasper settled on the narrow cot, making himself comfortable despite the shackles around his ankles. These moments with Mabel were precious now, numbered like the hours until dawn. He began the familiar tale he'd created for her, about a brave little rabbit who'd lost her family but found courage in the most unexpected places. Once upon a time, there was a rabbit named Rose who lived in a meadow where the grass grew tall and sweet, he began, his deep voice gentle in the gathering dusk. Rose was smaller than the other rabbits, but she had the biggest heart in the whole meadow. As he spoke, Mabel's grip on the bars loosened slightly, her breathing becoming more even. This was their ritual, their way of holding on to something good in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. Through the small window, Jasper could see Doc Henley approaching the jail, his medical bag in one hand and a troubled expression on his weathered face. "Evening, Jasper," Doc said quietly, nodding to Deputy Cartwright, who unlocked the outer door to let him into the corridor between the cells. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I deserve," Jasper replied, though his eyes remained focused on Mabel, "and better than I expected." Doc Henley had spent the day examining Victoria Sterling's body more thoroughly than the rushed investigation had allowed. What he'd found troubled him deeply, inconsistencies that spoke of a more complex crime than the simple murder everyone wanted to believe. "Mabel, sweetheart," Doc said gently, "why don't you run along to Mrs. Patterson's house? She's got some fresh apple cake waiting for you." Mabel shook her head stubbornly. "I want to stay with Jasper." "It's all right, little one," Jasper said, understanding that Doc needed to speak privately. "Go have some cake. I'll still be here when you come back." The words carried a weight they all understood. He'd be here tonight, but tomorrow was a different story. Mabel reluctantly kissed her fingers and pressed them through the bars to touch Jasper's hand before running off into the darkness. Doc waited until her footsteps faded before speaking. "I've been examining the crime scene more carefully," he said quietly. There are things that don't add up, such as the angle of the wounds, for one thing. Victoria was stabbed, but the blade came from below, thrust upward. Given her height, and yours, that would be an awkward angle for you to manage. Jasper listened without comment, understanding that Doc was grasping for hope in the face of overwhelming circumstantial evidence. There's something else, Doc continued, pulling a small object from his coat pocket. I found this near the body, caught in some brush where Knox's men missed it. He held up a silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful. Inside was a miniature portrait of Victoria Sterling, but the locket itself was engraved with initials that weren't hers. W.C. To V.S. Forever yours. W.C., Jasper mused. Wade Cartwright. That's what I'm thinking. Knox's deputy has been mighty quiet since the murder, drinking more than usual, jumping at shadows. Before Jasper could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the night. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, and Doc Henley's face paled as he recognized the lead figure. It was Quinn Mackenzie, a man from Jasper's past, a past that Jasper had hoped would stay buried forever. Quinn dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence, his weathered face scanning the jail with professional interest. He was smaller than Jasper, but carried himself with the coiled tension of a rattlesnake ready to strike. The 2 men with him hung back, their hands never far from their weapons. Well, Quinn said, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. Iron Fist Dalton, reduced to rotting in a frontier jail. How the mighty have fallen. Doc Henley's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Jasper had hoped to avoid. His true identity was about to become common knowledge in a town that had already condemned him based on suspicion alone. Quinn, Jasper acknowledged quietly. It's been a long time. 2 years since you rode away from the gang, brother. 2 years since you decided you were too good for the life that made you rich. Quinn's eyes glittered with old resentment and fresh opportunity. Heard you were in trouble. Thought I'd come see if you needed any help getting out of this predicament. I don't want that kind of help. Quinn laughed, the sound harsh in the desert night. Still playing the reformed man, are you? Even with a rope waiting for you, come. Morning? Deputy Cartwright had emerged from the jail office, his hand resting nervously on his gun. Quinn's reputation had preceded him. He was known throughout the territory as a killer without conscience, the kind of man who'd shoot a lawman as easily as swatting a fly. You men need to move along, Cartwright said, though his voice lacked conviction. This is a peaceful town. Peaceful. Quinn's grin was wolfish. Brother, your peaceful town just condemned the wrong man. Jasper Dalton may have been a lot of things, but he never killed women or children. That was always his weakness. Too much conscience for the work we did. These words hit Doc Henley like a revelation. Here was someone who knew Jasper's true nature, someone who could testify to character traits that might save his life. But Quinn wasn't finished. Tell me, Deputy, Quinn continued, his voice silky with menace. What do you know about the man you're guarding? Do you know how many men he's killed? Do you know why they called him Iron Fist? Cartwright's face had gone pale, but it was Doc Henley who stepped forward, his medical training overriding his fear. If you know something that could help prove his innocence, you have a moral obligation to speak. Quinn studied the older man with amusement. Moral obligation. Doctor, you're talking to men who've lived outside morality for most of our lives. But I'll tell you this much for free. Jasper Dalton earned his reputation with his fists and his guns, but he earned his redemption by walking away from both. He turned back to Jasper, his expression growing serious. 2 years ago, you saved my life when you didn't have to. Could have let Brennan's posse string me up, but you cut me loose instead. Told me a man could change if he wanted it badly enough. I didn't believe you then. And now? Now I'm wondering if maybe you were right. Quinn glanced around the small jail, taking in the flowers Mabel had brought, the carefully folded blanket on Jasper's cot, the general atmosphere of a man at peace with himself despite his circumstances. This, the life you chose, playing daddy, to an orphan girl in a town that doesn't know your real name? It's a good life, Jasper said simply, Better than I deserved. Quinn was quiet for a long moment, studying his former partner with eyes that had seen too much violence and too little grace. Finally, he nodded slowly. Maybe it is at that. He looked at Doc Henley. You really think he's innocent of this murder? I know he is, Doc replied firmly. Then I reckon I'll stick around for a day or two, see what develops. Quinn's smile was sharp as a blade. After all, it's been too long since I've seen a proper hanging. Wouldn't want to miss the entertainment. As the three men rode away into the darkness, Doc Henley felt a mixture of hope and terror settle in his chest. Quinn Mackenzie was dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of extreme violence. But he was also someone who knew Jasper's true character, someone who might be willing to help if the price was right and the cause was just. In his cell, Jasper closed his eyes and tried not to think about the complications Quinn's presence would bring. Tomorrow would bring enough trouble without borrowing more from the ghosts of his violent past. But as he drifted towards sleep, one thought brought him comfort. If Quinn was here, it meant word of his situation had spread beyond Dry Creek. And if word had spread, there might be others who remembered the man he'd been beneath the reputation. Others who could testify to the possibility of redemption. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of rain and the promise of a storm approaching from the distant mountains. Change was coming to Dry Creek, whether the town was ready for it or not. The pocket watch lay half-buried beneath a fallen cottonwood branch, its ornate gold surface catching the first rays of dawn as Doc Henley searched the crime scene one more time. He'd risen before sunrise, determined to find something, anything, that might cast doubt on the rush to judgment that had condemned Jasper Dalton. The watch was beautiful, clearly expensive, with intricate engravings around its rim and a delicate chain that spoke of careful craftsmanship. Doc turned it over in his weathered hands, noting the initials engraved on the back. H.S. Harrison Sterling's watch, perhaps? But that made no sense. Sterling would hardly have dropped his own timepiece while murdering his daughter. The mechanism still worked, ticking steadily in the morning quiet. Doc opened the case, revealing not just the clock face, but a small compartment behind it. Inside, folded carefully, was a piece of paper with writing in a feminine hand. "Meet me at midnight by the cottonwoods. We must talk about what you've done." Victoria's handwriting, Doc realized with growing excitement. This wasn't evidence of Jasper's guilt. It was proof that Victoria had arranged to meet someone at the very spot where she died. Someone who owned an expensive pocket watch and had reason to fear what Victoria might reveal. Meanwhile, in the jail, Jasper was sharing his breakfast with an unexpected visitor. Mabel had arrived early, as she always did, but this time He brought company, a scraggly orange cat that had been hanging around the jail for the past week. "He's hungry," Mabel explained, tearing off pieces of her biscuit to feed the grateful feline. "Mrs. Patterson says cats are good judges of character. If Mr. Whiskers likes you, you must be a good person." Jasper smiled despite his circumstances, watching the little girl lavish attention on the stray cat. It was such a simple act of kindness, yet it reminded him of why he'd chosen this life, why he'd walked away from violence and embraced something gentler. "Tell me about before," Mabel said suddenly, her small hands still stroking the cat's matted fur. "Before you came to Dry Creek, where did you live?" It was a question Jasper had been dreading, knowing that his past would eventually catch up with him, but looking into Mabel's trusting eyes, he found he couldn't lie to her anymore. "I lived in a lot of places," he said carefully. "I traveled with some other men, and we did things I'm not proud of." "Bad things?" "Yes, very bad things." Mabel considered this solemnly, her young mind processing information that would have terrified most adults. "But you stopped doing bad things." "I stopped when I realized they weren't making me happy. They weren't making anyone happy." "What made you realize?" Jasper was quiet for a long moment, remembering a day 2 years earlier when everything had changed. Finally he spoke, his voice soft with old grief. "I had a family once, a wife named Sarah and a little boy named Thomas. They were killed by men who wanted to hurt me, men who knew that the best way to destroy someone was to take away what they loved most. Mabel's eyes filled with tears, not for herself, but for him. Like what happened to my mama and papa? Yes, a sweetheart exactly like that. Is that why you take care of me? Because you miss your little boy? The question pierced Jasper's heart with its innocent directness. Partly, he admitted, but mostly because you needed someone to take care of. You and I needed someone to take care of. Mabel nodded, as if this made perfect sense, which perhaps it did to a child who understood instinctively that love could grow from shared loss and mutual need. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Knox, his face grim with purpose. Behind him walked a stranger, a well-dressed man in his 50s with calculating eyes, and the soft hands of someone who'd never done physical labor. "Dalton," Knox said, "this is Judge Morrison from the Territorial Court. He's here to review your case." Judge Morrison studied Jasper with the detached interest of a man examining livestock. "I've read the trial transcript," he said in a nasal voice. "Seems straightforward enough. You'll hang at dawn tomorrow as scheduled." "Judge," came Doc Henley's voice from the jail entrance, slightly breathless from running. "I need to speak with you about new evidence." Knox's face darkened. "Doc, you need to accept that justice has been served." "Justice?" Doc held up the pocket. "Watch," letting it catch the morning light. "This watch was found at the crime scene, missed by your hasty investigation. It contains a note from Victoria Sterling arranging to meet someone at the exact spot where she died." Judge Morrison examined the watch with growing interest, reading the note inside. "This changes things," he admitted reluctantly. "If Miss Sterling arranged to meet someone, it doesn't change anything." Knox interrupted harshly. "She could have been meeting Dalton. He could have dropped the watch during the struggle. This watch is worth more than most men in this town. Make in a year," Doc pointed out. "Does it look like something a drifter would own?" Before anyone could answer, Quinn Mackenzie appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately commanding attention. He'd cleaned up since the previous night, trading his trail clothes for a respectable suit that made him look almost civilized. "Gentlemen," Quinn said pleasantly, "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion about that timepiece. Interesting craftsmanship, looks like the work of Heinrich Zimmermann, the Swiss clockmaker who settled in Santa Fe. Very exclusive, very expensive. Only made about 50 of them, each one custom-ordered." Judge Morrison looked up sharply. "How do you know so much about watches?" Quinn's smile was enigmatic. "Man in my former line of work learns to appreciate valuable things. We liberated quite a few such pieces from their previous owners over the years." "And what line of work was that?" the judge asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected. "I rode with the Mackenzie gang," Quinn replied without shame. "Same as Iron Fist Dalton here, until he decided to go respectable." The revelation sent shockwaves through the small group. Mabel pressed closer to the bars, her small face pale with confusion and fear. Judge Morrison stepped back instinctively, his hand moving toward the gun he probably didn't know how to use. "You're confessing to being an outlaw," Knox demanded. "Reformed." "Outlaw?" Quinn corrected. "Just like my friend Jasper here, though I'll admit my reformation is more recent and considerably less complete." Jasper watched this exchange with growing dread. Quinn was playing a dangerous game, one that could easily backfire and make things worse for everyone involved. "The point is," Quinn continued, "Jasper Dalton may have been a killer, but he was never a murderer. There's a difference, though most folks don't understand it. He killed men who were trying to kill him, in fair fights or during raids, but he never harmed a woman or child, never killed anyone who couldn't defend themselves." "How can we trust the word of an admitted criminal?" Judge Morrison asked. "Because, Your Honor, I have no reason to lie. If Jasper hangs tomorrow, it means nothing to me. We haven't been partners for 2 years, but I won't stand by and watch an innocent man die for something he didn't do, especially when the real killer is probably walking around free." Doc Henley seized on this opening. "That's exactly what I've been trying to tell you. The evidence doesn't support the conviction." The angle of the wounds, the expensive watch, the note arranging a secret meeting, it all points to someone else. Judge Morrison examined the watch again, clearly troubled by the inconsistencies. "Sheriff Knox, I'm ordering a stay of execution pending further investigation." Knox's face flushed with anger. "Judge, with respect, this is my jurisdiction." The man had a fair trial and was convicted by a jury of his peers. A trial that lasted 3 hours and ignored crucial evidence, Doc Henley interjected. "The execution will proceed as scheduled," Knox declared, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. But Judge Morrison had authority that superseded local law enforcement. "Sheriff, I'm overruling your decision. The execution is postponed for 72 hours while this new evidence is properly investigated." As the men argued about jurisdiction and procedure, Mabel reached through the bars to touch Jasper's hand. "Does this mean you're not going to die tomorrow?" she whispered. "It means we have a little more time," Jasper replied, though he could see the fury in Knox's eyes and knew that the sheriff would not be easily deterred from his course. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, matching the tempest, brewing in the hearts of men who had too much to lose if the truth finally came to light. The pocket watch ticked steadily in Doc Henley's hand, counting down moments toward either justice or catastrophe, while in the desert wind, the scent of change grew stronger with each passing hour. The coded letter arrived in Doc Henley's office that evening, slipped under his door while he tended to Mrs. Garrett's bronchitis. Written in Victoria Sterling's careful script, it appeared to be an innocent note about wildflower arrangements at first glance. But Doc had learned to read between lines during his years as the town's physician, interpreting symptoms that patients couldn't or wouldn't voice directly. "The blue roses bloom at midnight, when the moon is dark," the letter read. "Tell no one of the garden's secret, for the thorns draw blood from those who speak carelessly. The gardener knows where the treasure lies buried, but the price grows steeper with each passing season." It took Doc most of the night to decipher Victoria's careful code, but gradually the message became clear. She was being blackmailed by someone she called the gardener, someone who knew a secret worth killing for. The treasure buried likely referred to money hidden somewhere, and the steeper price suggested the blackmailer's demands were escalating. Meanwhile, across town, Quinn Mackenzie sat in the Silver Dollar Saloon, nursing a whiskey and watching Deputy Wade Cartwright drink himself into oblivion. The deputy had been at the bar since sunset, his hands shaking as he lifted glass after glass to his lips. Quinn had seen enough guilty men to recognize the signs. Cartwright was a man being eaten alive by his conscience. "Rough day?" Quinn asked, conversationally, sliding onto the stool beside the deputy. Cartwright looked up with bloodshot eyes, taking in Quinn's clean clothes and deceptively mild manner. "You're one of them outlaws who rode in yesterday." "Reformed outlaw," Quinn corrected gently. "Like I told the judge, sometimes a man has to change his ways or die trying." "Change?" Cartwright laughed bitterly. "Tell me, outlaw, can a man really change? Or does he just get better at hiding what he is?" Quinn studied the deputy with growing interest. This was a man on the edge, someone with secrets clawing at his insides like trapped animals. "Depends on what he's trying to change from," Quinn replied. "Some sins are heavier than others." Cartwright's laugh turned into a sob that he quickly disguised as a cough. What if a man started with something small, something that seemed harmless? What if it grew into something terrible before he could stop it? Like what? Like taking a little money from confiscated property, just a few dollars here and there, nothing anyone would miss. But then someone finds out, and they want more too. Keep quiet, and more, until you're stealing from the town treasury, from evidence lockers, from anywhere you can find it. Quinn leaned closer, sensing a confession brewing in the deputy's alcohol-soaked guilt. And what happens when the blackmailer gets greedy, when keeping quiet isn't enough anymore? Cartwright's hands trembled as he reached for his glass. What happens when she threatens to tell everyone? When she says she's tired of being part of it and wants to come clean, the words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Quinn felt the pieces clicking into place. Victoria Sterling hadn't been an innocent victim. She'd been part of the corruption, probably helping to cover up Cartwright's thefts in exchange for money or favors. But something had changed her mind, made her want to confess, and that decision had cost her life. "Cartwright," Quinn said quietly, "what did you do?" But the deputy was beyond answering. He slumped forward onto the bar, unconscious from whiskey and guilt, leaving Quinn with half a confession and a growing certainty about who had really killed Victoria Sterling. Back in the jail, Jasper was receiving an unexpected visitor. Widow. Morrison had arrived with a basket of food and a determined expression that suggested she had more on her mind than charity. She was a stern woman in her 60s, someone who'd raised 7 children and buried 2 husbands, giving her a perspective on human nature that was both harsh and compassionate. "I brought you some decent food," she said, unpacking cornbread, beans, and a jar of honey. "Can't have you facing your troubles on an empty stomach." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Morrison. But I'm not sure it's wise for you to be seen helping." "Me?" Widow Morrison fixed him with a stare that had cowed stronger men than Jasper Dalton. "Young man, I've been watching you for 3 months now. I've seen how you care for that little girl, how gentle you are with her. I've seen you fix Mrs. Patterson's roof without asking for payment and help old Pete with his heavy lifting when his arthritis acts up." She paused, settling into the chair beside his cell with the authority of someone who intended to stay a while. "I also heard what that Quinn fellow said about you never harming women or children. Made me think about my own prejudices, my own quick judgments. Mrs. Morrison." "Hush and let me finish." Her voice carried the steel of a woman who'd survived frontier hardships through sheer determination. "I've lived in this town for 30 years and I know its people. Victoria Sterling was a beautiful girl, but she was also spoiled and willful. If someone killed her, it wasn't because she was innocent." Jasper leaned forward, interested despite himself. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Victoria had secrets. I do the washing for half the families in town, including the Sterlings. I've seen things, letters that shouldn't exist, money changing hands that shouldn't be changing, meetings that shouldn't be happening." "What kind of meetings?" Widow Morrison glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Victoria and Deputy. Cartwright, for one. Not romantic meetings, business meetings. She'd slip him envelopes. He'd slip her things back. Always at night, always secretive." This confirmed what Quinn was discovering at the saloon, but Jasper needed more. "Did you ever see what was in the envelopes?" "Once. Victoria was careless with her laundry, left papers in her dress pocket. Bills of sale for cattle that had supposedly been stolen, signed by men who were supposedly victims of rustling." The implications hit Jasper like a physical blow. Cattle rustling was a hanging offense in this territory, but if the victims were actually selling their cattle to the rustlers and then claiming they were stolen, it was insurance fraud on a massive scale. "You think Victoria and Cartwright were involved in a rustling scheme?" "I think Victoria was helping Cartwright steal from the town and frame innocent ranchers for cattle theft. I think they were splitting the profits until something went wrong." Before Jasper could respond, Mabel appeared at the jail entrance, her small face pale with worry. She'd been staying with Doc Henley since the trial, but she visited Jasper every evening for their bedtime story ritual. "Mrs. Morrison." Mabel ran to the older woman, who wrapped her in a fierce hug. "Are you here to help Jasper too?" "I'm here to do what's right, child. Sometimes that takes an old woman longer to figure out than it should." As Widow Morrison unpacked the rest of her basket, she pulled out something unexpected, a small leather-bound journal. "This belonged to my late husband," she explained. "He was deputy sheriff before Cartwright, kept detailed records of everything that happened in this town. Look at the entries from 6 months ago." Jasper read the careful handwriting, his expression growing darker with each page. The journal documented a pattern of cattle thefts that corresponded exactly with Deputy Cartwright's patrol schedule. More damning still, it recorded suspicious meetings between Cartwright and several ranchers who later claimed to be victims of rustling. Your husband suspected the corruption? He more than suspected it. He was building a case against Cartwright. When he died, heart attack, the doctor said, but my Henry was healthy as a horse. I always wondered if someone helped that heart attack along. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a web of corruption that went far deeper than simple theft. Victoria Sterling hadn't been an innocent victim. She'd been a co-conspirator who'd decided to come clean, and that decision had cost her life. Mrs. Morrison, Jasper said carefully, if you're right about this, then everyone involved is in danger. The people behind this won't hesitate to kill again to protect their secret. Then we'd better move fast, the widow replied with grim determination, because that little girl needs you alive, and this town needs the truth. Outside, the storm that had been building all day finally broke, sending rain drumming against the jail windows. Lightning illuminated the dark streets, revealing figures moving through the shadows, men with purposes that required darkness and secrets that demanded silence. In the saloon, Quinn helped the unconscious Deputy Cartwright to his feet, supporting the drunk man's weight as he guided him toward the door. It was time for a more private conversation, one that might finally break open the conspiracy that had condemned an innocent man. The coded letter crackled in Doc Henley's pocket as he made his way through the rain toward the jail, his medical bag protecting Victoria's journal from the storm. Truth was a fragile thing, he reflected, easily destroyed by water or fire or the desperate actions of guilty men. But sometimes, if handled carefully and protected by people of courage, truth could survive long enough to set things right. Tonight, in a small frontier town being washed clean by the desert rain, truth was about to test its strength against the forces that had tried so hard to bury it. Victoria Sterling's diary lay open on Doc Henley's desk, like a window into a troubled soul, its pages filled with elegant handwriting that grew increasingly desperate as the entries progressed. The artifact had been hidden behind a loose board, in the church organ, discovered by young Timothy Matthews when he'd volunteered to help the preacher with repairs. March 15th, Doc read aloud to the small group gathered in his office. Wade came to me again today. The amounts keep growing, and Father is starting to ask questions about the household accounts. I told Wade this has to stop, but he says we're in too deep now. Widow Morrison nodded grimly from her chair beside the window. I knew that girl was troubled. The washing she sent over these past months, dresses stained with tears, handkerchiefs soaked through with worry. Quinn Mackenzie leaned against the wall, his earlier conversation with Deputy Cartwright having yielded disturbing revelations. Cartwright confessed to embezzlement, but he swears he didn't kill her, says someone else was pulling the strings, someone with more to lose than a corrupt deputy. April 2nd, Doc continued reading. The cattle scheme is getting out of hand. Wade says we've made nearly $3,000, but the rustlers are demanding a bigger cut. They know we can't expose them without exposing ourselves. I feel like I'm drowning. Mabel sat quietly in the corner, her rag doll clutched tightly. As she listened to the adults discuss things she didn't fully understand, but she understood enough to know they were trying to save Jasper, and that was all that mattered to her young heart. Who were these rustlers? Widow Morrison asked. Did Victoria mention names? Doc flipped through several pages, searching for specifics. Here, April 20th, saw Kay meeting with the Mexican in the old barn again. They were arguing about something, voices raised. Kay looked angry when he left, angrier than I've ever seen him. I'm starting to think this was never about the money for him. Kay, Quinn mused, could be Knox. The suggestion sent a chill through the room. If Sheriff Knox was involved in the corruption, it explained his eagerness to convict Jasper and his resistance to any investigation that might uncover the truth. There's more, Doc said, turning to a page near the end of the diary. May 15th, just 2 weeks before her death. I can't do this anymore. The guilt is eating me alive, and Father is getting suspicious. I told Kay, I want out, want to confess everything and face the consequences. He didn't take it well. Said there are consequences worse than jail, consequences that involve people I care about. The threat was clear, even veiled in Victoria's careful language. Knox had threatened her, probably threatened her father as well, to keep her from confessing. Last entry, Doc announced, his voice heavy with the weight of impending tragedy. May 28th, the day before she died. Kay wants to meet tonight by the cottonwoods. Says he has a solution to our problem. I'm scared, but I have to go. If something happens to me, the truth is hidden in the place where music meets the heavens. The eye. Organ, Widow Morrison breathed. That's where the boy found the diary. Quinn straightened, his predatory instincts sharpening. Knox killed her. It's the only explanation that fits all the facts. Meanwhile, across town in the Silver Dollar Saloon, Sheriff Knox was having his own meeting with forces that preferred to remain in the shadows. The Mexican that Victoria had mentioned in her diary sat across from him, a scarred man named Diego Mendoza, who ran cattle-rustling operations across 3 territories. The girl is dead, Knox said quietly, his voice barely audible over the saloon's evening noise. The problem is contained. Diego's dark eyes glittered with cold intelligence. And the big man who takes the blame, he will hang tomorrow. Day after tomorrow now. Judge Morrison insisted on more time, but it won't matter. No one will believe an outlaw's word over mine. You are certain he knows nothing? Knox nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at his gut. Jasper Dalton was proving more troublesome than expected, inspiring loyalty in people who should have remained. Neutral. Doc Henley's investigation was uncovering too much, asking too many questions. What about the deputy? Cartwright is drinking himself into confessions. Cartwright is weak, Knox admitted, but he's too scared to tell the whole truth. He knows what happens to people who cross us. Diego leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. Sheriff, you have been well paid for your cooperation. But if this arrangement becomes inconvenient, we can find other lawmen to work with. The threat was unmistakable. Knox had taken their money, helped them organize the cattle-rustling scheme provided inside, information about ranchers' movements and schedules. In return, he'd become wealthy enough to contemplate retirement to a nice house in California, far from the harsh realities of frontier justice. But Victoria Sterling's conscience had threatened to destroy everything, forcing Knox to make a choice between his future and her life. The choice had been easier than he'd expected. Back in the jail, Jasper was receiving another visitor, the traveling preacher who'd arrived in town just after Victoria's murder. Reverend Isaiah Blackwood was a tall, thin man with intense eyes and a voice that could carry across a valley when he delivered his sermons. Brother Dalton, the preacher said, settling into the chair beside the cell. I've been praying about your situation, asking the Lord for guidance. I appreciate that, Reverend, though I'm not sure how much good it'll do. The Lord works in mysterious ways, son. Sometimes he sends angels disguised as sinners, and sometimes he reveals truth through the most unexpected vessels. Jasper studied the preacher's face, sensing something more than religious comfort in his visit. You have something specific on your mind? Reverend Blackwood glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then leaned closer to the bars. I knew your father, Jasper. Knew him well, back in Missouri before the war. The revelation hit Jasper like a physical blow. His father had died when Jasper was 15, killed in a farming accident that had left the family destitute and forced Jasper to make choices that had shaped his violent path. Thomas Dalton was a good man, the preacher continued, a God-fearing man who raised his son to know right from wrong. When I heard that Iron Fist Dalton was Thomas's boy, it broke my heart to think of how far you'd fallen. And now I see a man who's found his way back to his father's teachings. The way you care for that little girl, the gentle manner you've shown even in the face of false accusations. Thomas would be proud of the man you've become. Tears stung Jasper's eyes at the unexpected grace of this moment. To hear that his father would be proud, despite everything he'd done, despite the blood on his hands and the years of violence that had defined his reputation, it was a gift he hadn't dared hope for. "Reverend, if I don't survive this, will you look after Mabel? Make sure she goes to good people. You're going to survive this, son. I feel it in my bones, in my soul. The Lord isn't finished with you yet." As if summoned by their conversation, Mabel appeared in the doorway, her small face lighting up when she saw the preacher. She'd taken a liking to Reverend Blackwood, drawn by his gentle manner and the way he included children in his sermons instead of treating them as nuisances. "Reverend Blackwood, are you here to pray for Jasper?" "I am indeed, little one, and to bring him news that might help with his troubles." The preacher reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. "This is a letter your father wrote to me before he died, Jasper. He asked me to give it to you if I ever found you, if you ever needed to remember who you really are." With trembling hands, Jasper unfolded the letter and read his father's careful script. "My dear son, if you are reading this, then you have strayed from the path we tried to set for you. But remember, it is never too late to come home to who you were meant to be. You have a good heart, Jasper. Trust it to guide you back to the light." As thunder rolled across the desert sky and rain drummed against the jail windows, 3 generations of faith converged in that small cell. A dead father's wisdom, a living son's redemption, and a child's innocent trust that good would ultimately triumph over evil. Outside, the forces of corruption were gathering for a final assault on the truth, but inside the jail, hope was kindling like a candle flame that refuses to be extinguished by the darkness surrounding it. The blood-stained bandana was discovered purely by accident, tucked behind a loose board in Sheriff Knox's office when Doc Henley went to deliver his official medical report on Victoria Sterling's wounds. The fabric was blue cotton, expensive. Quality, with the initials KB embroidered in one corner. Knox Brennan's personal bandana, the one he wore when the desert dust got thick. Doc Henley stared at the damning evidence, his hands trembling as he realized the full scope of the conspiracy. The blood was dried now, brown and stiff, but clearly visible against the blue fabric. This wasn't evidence that Knox had missed. This was evidence that Knox had hidden because he was the killer. The confrontation that followed would be remembered in Dry Creek for generations to come. Doc Henley burst into the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Knox was concluding his meeting with Diego Mendoza, the blood-stained bandana clutched in his weathered fist like an accusation made manifest. "You murdering bastard," Doc's voice carried across the saloon, silencing conversations and drawing every eye to the drama unfolding near the bar. "I found your bandana, Knox. Found it hidden in your office with Victoria Sterling's blood all over it." Knox's face went white, then red, as the implications of discovery crashed over him like a collapsing wall. His hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but the packed saloon made violence impossible. Too many witnesses, too many people who would remember what they'd seen. "That doesn't prove anything," Knox managed, though his voice lacked conviction. "Could be anyone's bandana with your initials embroidered on it." Doc held up the fabric, making sure everyone in the saloon could see the monogram. "This is your personal bandana, the one you always wear. I've seen it 100 times." Diego Mendoza had melted away into the crowd at the first sign of trouble, disappearing through a back door with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to avoiding inconvenient situations. But his departure only made Knox's position more precarious, abandoning him to face the consequences alone. Quinn Mackenzie stepped forward from where he'd been nursing a whiskey at the far end of the bar. "Interesting timing, Sheriff. Man starts investigating your corruption, and suddenly he finds evidence that proves you're a killer. Stay out of this, outlaw. This doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does concern me," Quinn replied, his voice carrying the edge of steel beneath silk. "You see, while you were busy murdering innocent girls, I was having an enlightening conversation with your deputy. Wade Cartwright told me some fascinating stories about cattle rustling and embezzlement, about how you forced him to help steal from the town treasury. Knox's composure cracked further. The saloon patrons were pressing closer now, sensing blood in the water. These were frontier people who understood justice in its rawest form, and the evidence against their sheriff was mounting too high to ignore. "Cartwright's a drunk and a liar," Knox protested. "You can't believe anything he says." "Then let's ask him ourselves," Doc Henley suggested. "Where is Deputy Cartwright, Sheriff? Haven't seen him since this morning." The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Knox's eyes darted toward the door, calculating distances and escape routes, but the crowd had grown larger and more hostile. Word was spreading through the saloon and out into the street. Sheriff Knox was being accused of murder. "Cartwright is sleeping off a drunk," Knox said finally. "He'll be fine by morning." But Quinn's smile was sharp as a blade. "Actually, Sheriff, your deputy won't be sleeping anything off. Found him floating in the creek about an hour ago, his neck broken and his pockets full of rocks." The revelation hit the crowd like lightning. Murmurs turned to angry shouts, and more people pressed into the saloon as word spread through Dry Creek that their sheriff was not just corrupt, but a multiple murderer. Knox's hand finally closed on his gun, but before he could draw it, a familiar voice cut through the chaos from the saloon's entrance. "Knox Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Victoria Sterling and Wade Cartwright." Everyone turned to see Jasper Dalton standing in the doorway, no longer wearing shackles, flanked by Judge Morrison and Reverend Blackwood. The big man's presence filled the room with quiet authority, and his calm demeanor was more intimidating than any show of violence could have been. "How did you get out of jail?" Knox demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence and ordered my immediate release," Jasper replied evenly. "Seems like an innocent man doesn't belong in a cell while the real killer walks free." Judge Morrison stepped forward, his official bearing commanding respect even in the charged atmosphere of the saloon. "Sheriff Knox, based on the physical evidence discovered by Dr. Henley and the testimony of multiple witnesses, I'm issuing a warrant for your arrest." Knox laughed bitterly, a sound that held no humor. "You think you can arrest me in my own town? You think these people will believe an outlaw and a country doctor over their sheriff?" But as he looked around the saloon, Knox saw only hostile faces staring back at him. The people of Dry Creek had trusted him for 5 years, given him their respect and their authority. Learning that he'd betrayed that trust for money and killed to cover his crimes had turned their support into fury. "Tell us about the cattle rustling, Knox," someone called out from the crowd. "Tell us how you helped steal from your own people." "Tell us about Victoria," another voice demanded. "Tell us why you killed that poor girl." Knox's composure finally shattered completely. The weight of his crimes, the pressure of discovery, and the hostile faces surrounding him broke whatever restraint he'd been maintaining. His hand jerked toward his gun, but Jasper was already moving. The big man crossed the saloon in 3 quick strides, his hand closing over Knox's wrist before the sheriff could clear leather. There was no violence in the gesture, just the inexorable strength of a man who'd learned to control his power rather than unleash it. "Don't make it worse for yourself," Jasper said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen enough violence to know its true cost. Knox struggled briefly against Jasper's grip, then sagged in defeat. The fight went out of him, all at once, leaving behind only a broken man facing the consequences of choices that had seemed so reasonable when money was the only consideration. "You don't understand," Knox said, his voice barely a whisper. "It started small, just a little. Information about patrol schedules, nothing that would really hurt anyone, but then they wanted more and more. And Victoria..." "Victoria what?" Doc Henley pressed, still clutching the blood-stained bandana. "Victoria got scared, started talking about confessing, about doing the right thing, said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore." Knox's laugh was hollow, defeated. "The right thing. As if any of us could afford the right thing after what we'd done." The confession poured out of him like water from a broken dam. 5 years of corruption, starting with small favors for Diego Mendoza's organization and escalating into full partnership in cattle rustling operations. Victoria had been the perfect inside source, using her social connections to identify wealthy ranchers and their schedules. She was supposed to meet me that night to discuss terms, Knox continued, his voice growing stronger as the relief of confession overtook his fear. Thought I could reason with her, make her see that we were all in too deep to back out now. But she wouldn't listen, Judge Morrison said, understanding the inevitable trajectory of the story. She laughed at me, said I was a coward and a fool, that she'd rather face prison than live with the guilt another day. Said she was going to tell her father everything in the morning. So you killed her. Knox nodded slowly, the admission hanging in the air like a death sentence. Didn't plan to. Brought a knife to threaten her, make her understand how serious the situation was. But she fought back, tried to scream for help. Everything happened so fast. The crowd in the saloon had grown silent, listening to a man destroy himself with his own words. Some faces showed satisfaction at justice finally emerging. Others showed the sick fascination that comes with witnessing human tragedy unfold. "And Cartwright?" Jasper asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Started drinking, talking too much. Told that outlaw friend of yours about the embezzlement. Would have told him about the cattle rustling too, if I'd given him time." Knox looked directly at Quinn. "Your conversation with him spooked me. Couldn't risk him telling anyone else." "So you murdered him too. Made it look like an accident. Drunks fall in creeks all the time, especially drunks with guilty consciences." Judge Morrison stepped forward, his face grave with the weight of official duty. "Knox Brennan, by your own confession and the evidence presented, I find you guilty of 2 counts of murder, conspiracy to commit cattle rustling, and embezzlement of public funds. You'll be held pending formal trial and sentencing." But Knox wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had found something in the crowd, some face that brought fresh fear to his expression. Diego Mendoza had returned, standing near the back of the saloon with 2 of his men, their faces cold with the promise of violence. "Judge," Knox said desperately, "you need to protect me. These men I worked with, they don't leave loose ends." Diego's smile was sharp as a razor. "Sheriff Knox speaks truly. We do not appreciate partners who draw attention to our business." The atmosphere in the saloon shifted suddenly, tension ratcheting up as armed men faced each other across the crowded room. Diego's presence reminded everyone that Knox's crimes were part of a larger conspiracy, one that wouldn't end with the sheriff's arrest. "This ends now," Jasper said firmly, positioning himself between the criminals and the crowd of innocent townspeople. "Whatever business you had with Knox is finished. Time for you to ride out of Dry Creek and not come back." Diego's laugh was soft and dangerous. "Big man thinks he can frighten us. We know who you are, Iron Fist Dalton. Your reputation precedes you, but you are one man against many, and you fight for people who would have hanged you yesterday. Maybe." "So," Jasper admitted, his voice calm despite the threat, "but these people deserve better than to live in fear of men like you. And that little girl deserves to grow up in a town where justice means something." As if summoned by his words, Mabel appeared in the saloon doorway, her small face bright with joy at seeing Jasper free. She started to run toward him, but Quinn caught her gently, lifting her into his arms and moving her away from the potential violence. "Uncle Quinn," she said, having adopted him as honorary family, "is Jasper really free? Are the bad men going to leave us alone now?" Quinn looked into her innocent eyes, then at the armed standoff developing in the saloon. "That's what we're working on, little darling. That's exactly what we're working on." The storm outside was reaching its peak, lightning illuminating the street through the saloon windows, and thunder drowning out the whispered conversations of men preparing for violence. In a few moments, the careful balance would tip one way or another, toward justice or chaos, toward peace or bloodshed. But for now, in the eye of the storm, truth had finally emerged from the shadows where it had been hiding. Knox's confession had validated everything Doc Henley and the others had suspected, proving that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones wearing badges and hiding behind the law they've sworn to uphold. The blood-stained bandana lay on the bar like evidence of a corrupt system's failure, but also like proof that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when people of courage refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Jasper's father's Bible lay open on the small table in Doc Henley's office, its worn pages revealing generations of family history recorded in careful handwriting. The artifact had traveled with Reverend Blackwood for 20 years, waiting for the moment when it might provide comfort to a lost son. Now, as dawn approached and the final confrontation loomed, it served as both anchor and inspiration for a man preparing to face his past. "The Lord is my shepherd," Jasper read quietly, his finger tracing the familiar words his father had read to him as a child. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Mabel sat beside him, her small hand resting on his arm as she listened to the soothing cadence of the ancient words. The events in the saloon had frightened her, but being back at Jasper's side had restored her sense of safety. She didn't fully understand the danger they all faced, but she understood that the bad men weren't finished with them yet. "Jasper," she said softly, "are we going to have to run away?" "No, sweetheart. Running doesn't solve anything. Sometimes a man has to stand his ground and face whatever comes." Across the room, Doc Henley was cleaning his old service revolver, checking the cylinder and loading fresh cartridges with the methodical care of a man who'd once been a cavalry surgeon during the border wars. His medical training had taught him to preserve life, but his military experience had shown him that sometimes life could only be preserved through violence. "Haven't held this in 15 years, he muttered, testing the weapon's balance. "Hoped I'd never have to hold it again." Quinn Mackenzie leaned against the window, watching the street for signs of Diego Mendoza's men. The outlaw had positioned himself as their unofficial military advisor, his years of violent experience making him the most qualified to plan their defense. "They'll come before dawn," he said with quiet certainty. "Diego doesn't like loose ends, and we represent a very large loose end." Knox's confession implicated their whole operation. "How many men does he have?" Doc asked. "At least 6 that I saw, maybe more. All experienced killers, all armed with repeating rifles. We're outnumbered and outgunned." Widow Morrison emerged from the back room where she'd been preparing medical supplies, her face set with the grim determination of a woman who'd survived Indian raids and outlaw attacks. "Then we'd better be smarter than them," she said practically. "Numbers don't mean everything in a fight." The small group had gathered in Doc's office because it was the most defensible building in town, thick adobe walls, limited access points, and a clear view of the surrounding streets. Other townspeople had barricaded themselves in their homes, heeding Quinn's advice to stay out of the coming battle. Reverend Blackwood sat quietly in the corner, his hands folded in prayer but his eyes alert and watchful. The preacher had seen violence before, had ministered to dying men on both sides of border conflicts, and he understood that sometimes righteous men had to fight to protect the innocent. "There's something else," Quinn said, turning from the window. "Knox isn't the only corrupt lawman in the territory. Diego mentioned other sheriffs, other towns where they've bought cooperation. If we expose this operation, it could bring down a whole network of corruption. All the more reason for them to make sure we don't survive to testify," Doc observed grimly. Jasper closed the Bible gently, his decision made. "Then we make our stand here. We protect this town and everyone in it." "Jasper," Mabel said, tugging on his sleeve. "I'm scared." He lifted her onto his lap, holding her close as he searched for words that would comfort without lying. "Do you remember the story about the brave little rabbit?" She nodded, pressing her face against his chest. "Well, sometimes rabbits have to be very brave, even when they're scared. And sometimes big people have to be brave too, even when they don't want to fight." Will you be brave? I'll be as brave as I need to be to keep you safe. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but the wind still howled through the streets like a warning of violence to come. Lightning continued to flash, illuminating armed figures moving through the shadows. Diego's men taking positions around the doctor's office. Quinn spotted them first, his trained eye catching movement where others would see only darkness. "There, here," he announced quietly. "6 men that I can see, probably more I can't." Doc Henley moved to blow out the lamps, plunging the office into darkness. "Mrs. Morrison, take Mabel to the back room and keep her down. The rest of us will—" "No," Mabel interrupted firmly, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "I want to stay with Jasper. Sweetheart, it's going to be dangerous. I don't care. You're all I have left, and I'm not going to hide while bad men try to hurt you." Jasper looked into her determined eyes and saw an echo of his own stubbornness, his own refusal to abandon the people he cared about. Perhaps it was wrong to let a 6-year-old witness violence, but perhaps it was also wrong to lie to her about the realities of the world they lived in. "You can stay," he decided, "but you have to promise to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. I promise." The first shot shattered the front window, sending glass flying across the room. Quinn immediately returned fire, his rifle speaking with authority in the confined space. Doc Henley positioned himself at a side window, his revolver steady despite his years away from combat. "They're testing our response," Quinn called out over the gunfire. "Seeing how many guns we have, how well we're organized." More shots followed, coming from multiple directions now as Diego's men revealed their positions. The adobe walls were thick enough to stop most bullets, but the windows remained vulnerable points that had to be defended. Reverend Blackwood surprised everyone by producing a shotgun from beneath his coat, moving to cover the back door with calm efficiency. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," he said simply when he caught Doc's surprised look. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. Bursts of gunfire followed by tense silence as both sides reloaded and repositioned. Diego's men had the advantage of numbers and mobility, but the defenders had better cover and the desperate motivation of people fighting for their lives. "Jasper!" Diego's voice called out from the street, barely audible over the wind. "Send out the girl and the doctor, and we'll let you and the outlaw ride away." "Not a chance!" Jasper shouted back, chambering another round in his rifle. "Then you all die together. Your choice." The next assault came with more intensity, coordinated. Fire from multiple positions designed to pin down the defenders, while Diego's men advanced on the building. Quinn's expertise proved invaluable, directing their defense with the tactical skill of a man who'd survived dozens of similar fights. "Doc, watch the left window. They're trying to flank us." Quinn's rifle barked again, and a cry of pain from outside suggested he'd found his target. "Reverend, someone's trying the back door." The shotgun's roar answered him, followed by the sound of running feet as the would-be intruder retreated. Mabel huddled close to Jasper, her small body trembling with each gunshot, but her eyes bright with trust in his ability to protect her. She clutched her rag doll with one hand and gripped his shirt with the other, as if her touch could somehow keep him safe from the bullets flying through the darkness. "Tell me about the rabbit," she whispered during a brief lull in the shooting. Jasper kept his rifle trained on the window while he spoke, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "The brave little rabbit found herself in a dark forest, surrounded by wolves. But she wasn't alone. She had friends who cared about her, who would fight to keep her safe." "What happened to the wolves?" "They learned that sometimes the smallest, bravest hearts inspire the biggest, strongest people to do impossible things." Another volley of shots peppered the building, but the defenders held their positions. Hours passed in deadly tension, each side waiting for the other to make a mistake that could tip the balance of the fight. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the desert sky, exhaustion was taking its toll on everyone. Ammunition was running low, and the stress of the prolonged battle was wearing down even Quinn's iron nerves. "They're going to rush us soon," he predicted, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Diego knows we can't hold out forever." "Then we make every shot count," Doc replied, reloading his revolver with the last of his cartridges. Jasper checked his own ammunition, 3 rounds left in his rifle, 2 in his sidearm. Not much to work with when facing desperate men with power. Nothing left to lose. But as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the bullet-scarred street, reinforcements arrived from an unexpected source. Judge Morrison rode into town with a federal marshal and 6 armed deputies, their arrival announced by the thunder of hoofbeats and authoritative shouts. "This is Marshal Wade Blackstone. Throw down your weapons and surrender immediately." The tide of battle shifted in an instant. Diego's men, already exhausted from the long fight, found themselves caught between the defenders in the doctor's office and fresh lawmen with federal authority. The smart ones dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The stubborn ones died where they stood. Diego Mendoza himself tried to escape in the confusion, but Quinn Mackenzie was waiting for him. The 2 men faced each other in the dusty street. Their confrontation personal now, stripped of the larger conspiracy that had brought them together. "End of the line, Diego," Quinn said quietly, his rifle steady despite his fatigue. "Perhaps for both of us, outlaw." But the Mexican's hand was already moving toward his gun, and Quinn's finger was already tightening on the trigger. The final shot of the battle echoed across Dry Creek like punctuation at the end of a violent sentence, and Diego Mendoza fell face down in the dirt, his reign of corruption ended by a reformed outlaw who'd chosen redemption over revenge. As the smoke cleared, and the sun rose fully over the battered town, Jasper held Mabel close and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The peace that comes from knowing you've stood for something worth fighting for, something worth dying for if necessary. The Bible lay open beside them, its pages no longer needed for comfort, but serving now as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, faith and courage could light the way forward. The hangman's noose still swayed in the morning breeze, its rough hemp rope a stark reminder of how close justice had come to claiming an innocent life. The gallows stood empty now in the town square, but Marshal Blackstone had ordered it left, standing as evidence of the corruption that had nearly condemned Jasper Dalton to death. "Ladies and gentlemen of Dry Creek," Marshal Blackstone announced to the crowd gathered in the square, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "We are here this morning not for an execution, but for the administration of true justice." The mice, townspeople who had gathered to witness Jasper's hanging, now found themselves witnesses to a very different kind of spectacle. Knox Brennan stood in shackles between 2 federal deputies, his face haggard from a sleepless night in custody. The man who had ruled their town with an iron fist now looked small and defeated, his authority stripped away along with his badge. Doc Henley stepped forward, still bearing the cuts and bruises from the night's battle, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "Friends, we have been deceived. The man we trusted to protect us betrayed that trust for money and power. Victoria Sterling died, not because she was innocent, but because she threatened to expose the corruption that had infected our law enforcement." A murmur ran through the crowd, anger, disbelief, and growing understanding of how thoroughly they had been manipulated. These were people who valued honesty and hard work, who had built their community on mutual trust and shared responsibility. Learning that their sheriff had sold them out to criminals cut deep into their sense of identity. "Bring forth the evidence," Marshal Blackstone commanded. Quinn Mackenzie emerged from Doc Henley's office, carrying a wooden crate filled with documents, ledgers, and physical evidence collected during the investigation. The blood-stained bandana lay on top, its damning testimony visible to everyone in the square. "This bandana belongs to Knox Brennan," Quinn announced, holding it up for all to see. "It was found hidden in his office, stained with Victoria Sterling's blood. Physical proof that he murdered the girl he swore to protect." Knox's composure cracked further. "I never meant for it to go that far," he said, his voice barely audible over the crowd's growing hostility. "It was supposed to be simple, just. Information about patrol schedules, nothing that would really hurt anyone. But it did hurt people, Widow Morrison called out from the crowd, her voice sharp with righteous anger. It hurt every rancher who lost cattle, every family that went hungry because of your greed. Judge Morrison stepped forward, his official robes lending gravity to the proceedings. Knox Brennan, you stand accused of multiple murders, conspiracy to commit cattle rustling, embezzlement of public funds, and corruption of office. How do you plead? Knox looked around the square at faces that had once shown him respect, now twisted with disgust and betrayal. His shoulders sagged as the full weight of his crimes settled upon him. Guilty, he whispered. God help me, I'm guilty of it all. The crowd erupted in shouts and angry cries, their emotions finally finding release after the tension of the past few days. Some called for immediate justice, for Knox to face the same rope that had awaited Jasper. Others demanded answers about the scope of the corruption, about how many other officials might be involved. Marshal Blackstone raised his hand for silence. Knox Brennan, by your own confession and the evidence presented, you are sentenced to hang for the murders of Victoria Sterling and Wade Cartwright. The sentence will be carried out at dawn tomorrow. No, came a quiet voice from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see Jasper Dalton approaching, Mabel's small hand clasped in his own. The big man walked with quiet dignity, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. He had cleaned up from the night's battle, but his clothes still bore stains from gunpowder and blood. Marshal, Jasper continued, his voice carrying clearly across the square, with respect, hanging Knox won't bring back the people he killed or repair the damage he's done to this community. What would you suggest, Mr. Dalton? Marshal Blackstone asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. Life in prison, hard labor. Let him live with what he's done. Let him work to pay back some of what he stole. Death is too easy for a man like him. Knox stared at Jasper in amazement. Here was the man he had tried to murder through legal execution, showing mercy that Knox himself had never offered to anyone. Why? Knox asked, his voice breaking. Why would you spare me after what I tried to do to you? Jasper looked down at Mabel, then back at the broken sheriff. Because that little girl has seen enough death. Because this town has seen enough violence. Because sometimes mercy is stronger than vengeance. The crowd was silent now, absorbing the profound gesture of forgiveness from a man who had every right to demand blood for blood. Some faces showed understanding, others disappointment that their desire for immediate justice was being thwarted. Furthermore, Jasper continued, Knox has information about other corrupt officials, other towns where this conspiracy has taken root. He's more valuable to justice alive than dead. Marshal Blackstone nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Jasper's words. Very well, Knox Brennan, your sentence is commuted to life imprisonment with hard labor. You will be transported to the territorial prison, where you will serve your time and cooperate fully with our investigation into this corruption network. As the federal deputies led Knox away, the crowd began to disperse, their bloodlust satisfied by the promise of justice, if not by immediate execution. But many lingered, drawn by curiosity about the man who had shown such unexpected mercy to his enemy. Mabel tugged on Jasper's shirt, her young face serious with the weight of grown-up thoughts. Jasper, was that the right thing to do? He knelt down to her level, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. I don't know, sweetheart, but it felt like the right thing. Sometimes that's all we can do. Follow our hearts and hope they lead us towards something better. The noose continued to sway in the desert wind, empty now but somehow still ominous, a reminder that justice and vengeance often walk a narrow line between right and wrong. Knox's sheriff badge lay in the dust where Marshal Blackstone had torn it from his shirt, the metal star tarnished now with more than age. What had once symbolized authority and justice had become an emblem of corruption, its shine dulled by the blood of innocent people and the stain of betrayal. The final confrontation came not with gunfire or violence, but with the quiet dignity of truth, finally speaking louder than lies. As Knox was led away in federal custody, the real work of healing began, not just for Jasper and Mabel, but for an entire community that had to reckon with how thoroughly they had been deceived. "There's more we need to discuss," Marshal Blackstone announced to the remaining crowd. "The cattle rustling operation extended far beyond Dry Creek. We've identified at least 4 other towns where similar corruption has taken root." Doc Henley stepped forward, still clutching the evidence that had helped expose the conspiracy. "What happens to the money that was stolen? The cattle that were taken under false pretenses?" "We'll work with territorial authorities to make restitution where possible," the marshal replied. "But I won't lie to you. Some of that money is gone forever, spent or hidden where we may never find it." Harrison Sterling pushed through the crowd, his grief over Victoria's death now complicated by the knowledge of her involvement in the crimes. The wealthy rancher looked older than his years, aged by loss and the terrible understanding that his daughter had died not as an innocent victim, but as a participant in corruption. "Marshal," Sterling said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "what about my Victoria? She was involved in this conspiracy, but she was trying to make it right at the end. Your daughter's decision to confess likely saved many people from further harm," Marshal Blackstone acknowledged. "That should count for something in how we remember her." Widow Morrison approached Sterling with surprising gentleness, the stern woman's face soft with compassion. "Harrison, your girl made mistakes, but she found her conscience at the end. That takes courage, especially when you know the cost might be your life." Sterling nodded gratefully, accepting the comfort offered by a woman who had every reason to judge him harshly. His wealth and influence had insulated him from many of life's harsh realities, but grief was a great leveler, reducing even powerful men to simple human pain. Quinn Mackenzie emerged from the crowd, his face bearing fresh cuts from the night's battle, but his eyes clear with purpose. The outlaw had made his own choice about redemption, and like Jasper before him, he was discovering that choosing to do right could be more difficult than choosing to do wrong. "Marshal," Quinn said, "I want to ride with your investigation. Help you track down the other towns where this corruption has spread." "You're volunteering to work with federal law enforcement?" Marshal Blackstone asked, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "I know how these criminal networks operate, know the signs to look for, and I owe a debt to the man who showed me that change was possible." Quinn nodded toward Jasper. "Time I started paying that debt." Jasper watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction, seeing in Quinn's decision the same choice he had made 2 years earlier. Redemption, he had learned, was not a destination, but a daily decision to be better than you had been the day before. Mabel tugged on Jasper's hand, drawing his attention down to her serious young face. "What happens now?" she asked. "Where do we go?" The question touched the heart of everything they had fought for. In the chaos of recent events, it was easy to forget that their future remained uncertain. Jasper was free, his innocence proven, but he was still a man without official status in the community, caring for a child without legal authority. Judge Morrison seemed to read his thoughts. "Mr. Dalton, if you're willing, I'd like to discuss a permanent arrangement for Mabel's care. The territorial government has procedures for adoption in cases like this." "You mean Jasper could really be my papa?" Mabel's voice was bright with hope and wonder. "I mean exactly that, young lady. If that's what you both want." Jasper knelt down to Mabel's level, his weathered hands gentle on her small shoulders. "Do you want that, sweetheart? Do you want to be stuck with an old outlaw like me?" "You're not old," Mabel protested with the earnest logic of childhood, "and you're not really an outlaw anymore. You're just Jasper, and you're the best papa anyone and could have." The simple declaration hit Jasper with the force of a physical blow, tears stinging his eyes as he gathered the little girl into his arms. After years of violence and regret, after losing his first family to the consequences of his choices, he was being offered something he had never dared to hope for, a second chance at being a father. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I want that more than anything. Doc Henley approached them, his medical bag in one hand, and a broader smile than anyone had seen from him in years. "If you're going to be official residents of Dry Creek, you'll need a proper place to live. The Henderson cabin is yours if you want it, but I know a nice house closer to town that might suit a growing family better." "Growing family?" Jasper asked. Widow Morrison stepped forward, her stern expression softened by something approaching maternal warmth. "A man and a little girl need looking after," she announced practically. "I've been rattling around in that big house of mine for too long. Might be time to consider some permanent house guests." The offer was unexpected but deeply welcome. Mabel clapped her hands in delight at the prospect of living with Mrs. Morrison, whom she had grown to love despite the woman's gruff exterior. As the crowd finally began to disperse, carrying the news of justice served and corruption exposed, 3 generations prepared to become a family, forged not by blood, but by choice, not by law, but by love. The sheriff's badge remained in the dust, forgotten now as the town looked toward a future built on truth rather than lies, on justice rather than corruption, on the simple but profound understanding that sometimes the most broken people can become the strongest foundations for rebuilding what has been destroyed. The new family photograph sat proudly on the mantelpiece of Widow Morrison's house, its silver frame catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through clean windows. In the image, Jasper stood tall and dignified in his Sunday best, one large hand resting protectively on Mabel's shoulder while her small arms wrapped around his waist. Beside them, Widow Morrison, who now insisted everyone call her Grandma Ruth, stood with the satisfied expression of a woman who had found her purpose again after years of solitude. 6 months had passed since the dramatic events that had transformed Dry Creek from a town living under corruption's shadow into a community rebuilding itself on foundations of truth and justice. The changes went far deeper than new leadership or reformed institutions. They reached into the hearts of people who had learned that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to choose it. Jasper's adoption of Mabel had been finalized by Judge Morrison in a ceremony that brought tears to even the hardest eyes in town. The little girl who had once hidden in a closet while her parents were murdered now ran through the streets of Dry Creek with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved and protected. Her laughter, once rare and tentative, now rang out regularly from the schoolyard, where she played with friends who accepted her unusual family without question. "Papa Jasper," she called from the kitchen, where she was helping Grandma Ruth prepare dinner. "Quinn sent another letter from Santa Fe. He says they caught 3 more corrupt sheriffs and found almost all the stolen cattle." Jasper looked up from the rocking chair he was crafting, a wedding gift for Doc Henley, who had surprised everyone by proposing to the schoolma'am, Miss Sarah Collins. The former outlaw had discovered a talent for woodworking, his large hands proving as gentle with tools as they had once been deadly with weapons. "That's good news, sweetheart. Quinn's doing important work, helping clean up the mess that stretched across the whole territory." Quinn Mackenzie had indeed found his calling as a special investigator for the Federal Marshal's Office, using his knowledge of criminal operations to expose corruption in law enforcement throughout the Southwest. His letters to Jasper were filled with stories of towns freed from the grip of dishonest lawmen, of families getting their stolen property back, of justice finally reaching places where it had been absent for too long. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that 2 former outlaws had become instrumental in restoring law and order to the frontier. But as Doc Henley often observed, sometimes it took people who understood darkness to appreciate the value of light. Harrison Sterling had used his wealth and influence to help rebuild what corruption had damaged, funding a new school and contributing to a fund for families whose livestock had been stolen in the rustling scheme. The loss of his daughter had humbled the proud rancher, teaching him that money and power meant nothing without integrity to guide their use. "He also says he might come visit for Christmas," Mabel continued, her voice bright with anticipation. Can we make extra cookies if he does? We can make enough cookies to feed an army, Grandma Ruth declared from the stove, her voice warm with the contentment of a woman who had found family again after years of loneliness. Doc Henley had been elected as the new sheriff by a unanimous vote, his integrity and courage during the crisis making him the natural choice to restore trust in law enforcement. He wore the badge with appropriate gravity, understanding that it represented not just authority, but the sacred trust of the community he served. His first official act had been to establish new procedures for investigating crimes, ensuring that evidence would be properly collected and preserved rather than manipulated to serve corrupt purposes. The old gallows had been torn down, and its Wood used to build a new church bell tower, transforming an instrument of false justice into a symbol of hope and renewal. Reverend Blackwood had blessed the transformation, observing that even the most tainted materials could be redeemed when put to righteous use. Jasper set down his woodworking tools and walked to the window, looking out at the street where children played and adults went about their business with the relaxed confidence of people living in a safe community. The transformation wasn't complete, would never be complete perhaps, but it was substantial and genuine. "Mabel," he called. "Come here for a minute." She appeared in the doorway, her face dusted with flour from helping with the baking, her eyes bright with the curiosity that had returned as her sense of security grew stronger. "Do you remember what I told you about the brave little rabbit?" he asked, lifting her onto his lap in the big chair by the window. "She found her courage when she needed it most," Mabel recited, settling against his chest with the comfortable familiarity of a child who had never doubted her place in his heart. "That's right. And do you know what happened to her after the wolves were gone?" Mabel shook her head, though her smile suggested she suspected a happy ending was coming. "She built a burrow in the nicest meadow she could find, surrounded by friends who cared about her. And whenever other small animals were in trouble, she remembered how it felt to be scared and alone. So she helped them find their courage too. Like, you helped me find mine. Like we helped each other find ours," Jasper corrected gently. "That's what families do. They help each other be brave." Through the window, they could see Doc Henley making his evening rounds, checking on the businesses, and residents with the careful attention of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. His medical bag hung from one shoulder, his sheriff's badge gleamed on his vest, and his face bore the satisfaction of a man whose work served the greater good. "Papa Jasper," Mabel said thoughtfully, "do you ever miss being Iron Fist Dalton?" The in question was more perceptive than most adults would have managed, cutting to the heart of identity and transformation with the directness that only children could achieve. Jasper considered his answer carefully, wanting to be honest without being frightening. "I miss feeling powerful," he admitted. "When you're feared, you feel like you control everything around you. But I've learned that real strength comes from protecting people, not threatening them. Real power comes from building things up, not tearing them down." "And you like building things up better?" "Much better. Building things up means you get to be part of something larger than yourself. It means you get to have a family like ours." Grandma Ruth called them to dinner, and they joined her at the table where 3 generations shared food and conversation and the comfortable silences of people who belong together. The meal was simple but abundant, seasoned with gratitude and served with the understanding that some of life's greatest treasures couldn't be bought or stolen. They had to be earned through love and sacrifice and the daily choice to do right, by the people who mattered most. After dinner, as they had every evening for the past 6 months, Jasper read to Mabel from the Bible his father had left him, the worn pages offering comfort and guidance across generations. Tonight, he chose Psalm 23, the same passage he'd been reading on the morning when everything had started to unravel and come together simultaneously. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me," he read in his deep, gentle voice. "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine Enemies, thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Mabel's breathing had grown deep and even. Her small body relaxed in the security of familiar routine and unconditional love. Jasper closed the Bible carefully, kissed her forehead, and tucked the covers around her small form. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life," he whispered, completing the psalm, "and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." As he prepared for sleep in his own room, Jasper reflected on the journey that had brought him to this place. From feared outlaw to devoted father, from a man defined by violence to one whose greatest strength lay in gentleness. The road had been long and difficult, marked by loss and regret, and the sometimes painful process of learning to trust in something larger than his own strength. But tonight, listening to the peaceful sounds of his family settling in for sleep, he understood that redemption wasn't just about changing who you were. It was about discovering who you had always been meant to be. The capacity for good had always existed within him, buried beneath years of anger and violence, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of rain and the promise of growth, of new life emerging. From what had seemed like barren ground, Dry Creek slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, its people dreaming of tomorrow's possibilities rather than yesterday's fears. And in a house where love had triumphed over loss, where courage had conquered fear, where the most unlikely family had found its way to wholeness. A former outlaw named Jasper Dalton closed his eyes and dreamed of rocking chairs and school plays and all the ordinary miracles that would fill the years ahead. The photograph on the mantelpiece caught the last light of evening, its silver frame, reflecting not just three faces, but the radiant truth that sometimes the most broken people become the strongest foundations for building something beautiful and lasting and true.